Okay, let's have a bit of fun. Drawing upon these repeated stories that we've already looked at with regard to the Book of Mormon, Joseph's revelations, and his writings, we are going to expand that and look at Joseph's life and the texts that he is producing. One of the challenges in understanding Joseph is that we don't have a lot of writing about him, particularly not stuff which is contemporaneous. The biggest source we have for Joseph's early life, and indeed the Smith family in general, is Lucy Mack Smith's biography in 1845. She wrote extensively about the Smiths and the Mack families and included an understanding of the growing up of Joseph Smith in their household. Aside from that, we have a little bit from Joseph himself in his 1832 account of his history, and then also in his 1838 account, which was canonized. And then we have several affidavits done by Joseph's neighbors, and including the Hale family in 1834 and 1835. Several people talked about their interactions with the Smiths and with Joseph in general throughout his childhood in Western New York, and then the Hales family also talked about their involvement with Joseph from the time that he came to Harmony, Pennsylvania the first in 1825, and then his time there in particularly 1828 and 1829. But basically, we have nothing about Joseph from the time period, like anything but before 1829, really. And so there's nothing that's written down by Joseph or others because Joseph was nobody. He was a nothing. And the Smiths were incredibly poor. You know, pen and paper, ink were luxuries. And so Joseph never wrote down anything as far as we can tell. And nobody close to him wrote down anything about him until much later when he became somebody of importance. So we're often dealing with scraps of information that we're connecting together in kind of a mosaic puzzle where we only have maybe 10 to 12% of the pieces. And as a biographer of Joseph, I've had to look at those pieces really carefully, try and figure out some intertextuality, find some things that I think are going on that we can get some presence from, and be able to draw some conclusions which may just be educated guesses. And this is where I think that the Book of Mormon can be incredibly valuable. Along with those revelations that were given in 1828 and 1829, these are the first written ideas that Joseph communicated, usually to a scribe, which were written down. And if you understand the Book of Mormon as a Christian adventure story, as a combination of both the biblical record and Joseph's own life, we might be able to dissect some of the things that are going on and be able to make some really great comparisons and discoveries about what is happening to Joseph and why and when and how he's experiencing them and how he's relaying them back to the general public. So in this next series, we're going to look at the text of the Book of Mormon closely and look at the events and see if we can link them to Joseph's own life and draw some cross comparisons that will give us a good idea of what's going on and why and when and how, and we be able to underlie the evidence of his own story in the pages and words of the Book of Mormon. So this should be a lot of fun, and if you have any ideas or thoughts or correlations that you've seen, let me know so we can include them as we go. The Smiths were a big family, and they were from New England. They had roots that went back for hundreds of years, so they felt like Americans through and through. But they were also incredibly poor. They'd come from wealthy families, and even Lucy Mack had got a huge kind of dowry from her brothers in order to start her family, which was a massive help. Except that Joseph Smith Sr. speculated on ginseng exports to China and lost the family fortune, in which case Lucy Mack stumped up with her inheritance and basically bailed out the family from debt. But this meant that they were poor. They went from having a property to being tenants and moving around quite considerably. So when a volcanic eruption happened in Indonesia and blanketed the world with ash, this meant that New England had no summer and no crops, which meant potential starvation for lots of people, and particularly those who were already poor were really vulnerable, including the Smiths. So after repeated crop failure, they decided to make the move to Western New York, which was then the frontier of the United States, and the idea that they might be able to scratch out a living and improve their circumstances. They were joined by a lot of New England economic refugees who also went to Western New York and who took with them their grounding in New England folk magic. Some of the extended Smith and Mack families also moved through into New York, but a lot of the families stayed in New England, and so the families corresponded back and forth. And this is a really big move. It's not that it was meant that they never saw their family again, but it was a huge relocation, and it meant a big difference in their culture, but also their identity. It meant starting out in a new land with new ideas and new responsibilities. Definitely an Exodus story. This was also the case with the first family of the Book of Mormon, Lehi and his wife Sariah and their 4 sons, Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi. The heading to the first book of Nephi, which is the replacement text, says this: an account of Lehi and his wife Sariah and his 4 sons, being called, beginning at the eldest, Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi. The Lord warns Lehi to depart out of the land of Jerusalem, because he prophesies unto the people concerning their iniquity, and they seek to destroy his life. He taketh 3 days' journey into the wilderness with his family. Nephi takes the brethren and returneth to the land of Jerusalem after the records of the Jews, the accounts of their sufferings. They take the daughters of Ishmael to wife. They take their families and depart into the wilderness, their sufferings and afflictions in the wilderness, the course of their travels. They come to the large waters. Nephi's brethren rebel against him. He confoundeth them and buildeth a ship. They call the name of the place Bountiful. They cross the large waters into the promised land, and so forth. This is according to the account of Nephi, or in other words, I, Nephi, wrote this record. So there's a few things to point out. And firstly, that introduction at the beginning is written by Nephi. It's the account, and it's on the plates. It's not something that is added later. These chapter headings are things that are added later to give clarification to the text, but these things at the beginning are introductions, and William Davis calls this heads. This is an outline of what is going to happen, and it's put at the beginning so that then you can make sure that what is written is conforming to the outline. One of the first comparisons that you can probably see is that Nephi has these 3 older siblings, and Joseph also has 3 older siblings. He has his oldest brother Alvin, then Hiram, then his sister Sophronia, and then it's him. Now, we've already gone through chapter 1 and the idea that the visions that Lehi is having are then mirrored in Joseph Smith's history, particularly the 1832 account, where Joseph relays his first vision, and it seems to line up perfectly with the kind of order and understanding and verbiage and phrases that are used in chapter 1 of 1st Nephi. But if we look at 2nd Nephi, we understand that Nephi's got these 2 older siblings, Laman and Lemuel, who are really murmuring against their father for this idea that he's taking them out of their homeland, from their inheritance, and taking them out into the wilderness. And I don't think it's a stretch to think that this is probably the feeling of the older siblings when the Smiths moved from Vermont through to Western New York. The idea that, at this point, Alvin is 18 and Sophronia is 13, Hiram is 16. They've got lives and friends and opportunities, and maybe even, things that they think they're going to do in Vermont and in New England, and then their families suggesting that they move, thousands of miles away, which means that they are going to lose their connections, but also their prospects. Nephi in this account talks about how he's very young, but he believes his father, and he's able to go to the Lord in faith and get confirmation that what his father is doing is right. And he's then able to persuade his older brother Sam, and Sam joins him in believing that his father is correct. And I believe we see this interaction and family dynamic play out with Joseph as that younger brother and Sam as Hiram, that benign older brother who is supportive of his younger brother and his faith. It's probably also important to point out that the name Lemuel was also the name of the landlord that had evicted the Smith family, and Lemuel Durfee took over the property of the Smiths when they lost it later on. We'll talk about that later, but Lemuel is a name in Joseph's circumstance and around his area. And Laman is also in Joseph Smith's environment. There's a guy called Luman Waters who's called Laman often, and he's a part of the Smith understanding and family culture. And Laman is also the name of a parchment, a kind of esoteric spell document, which the Smith family have as well. And Joseph has a younger brother called Samuel that he becomes really close to as well. So it's interesting that the word Sam is used as one of the brothers as well. This is the beginning of the migration of the Smiths through to Western New York, and this is the beginning of the migration of Lehi and his family from the old world to the new. One of the most prominent stories in the Book of Mormon, because it occurs really at the very beginning, is Nephi's slaying of Laban to get the brass plates, the records of the Jews, which they then take to the Promised Land. This sets up a number of problematic ideas that permeate both in the Book of Mormon, but also into the early church. Because when Nephi comes across Laban, who is incapacitated with being drunk, he doesn't just tie him up, he kills him, a defenseless person, and yet this is supposed to be the will of God. The idea that the end justifies the means becomes a basis for a number of really tricky things that happen throughout the history of the church. But if we're looking at this as an autobiographical story, what event does this detail? I've made the case many times before that I believe that the Book of Mormon finishes at the end of 4th Nephi. Joseph finishes that in a hurry as he's relocating from Harmony, Pennsylvania through to Fayette, New York. He believes when he gets to New York, he'll be reunited with the lost manuscript that he believes that Martin Harris is hiding from him, testing him. He's described Martin Harris in Doctrine and Covenants section 3 as a wicked man, and that is reiterated again in Doctrine and Covenants section 10. But I believe the slaying of Laban is really rooted in Joseph's anger at not being able to recover the lost manuscript, and really a death to Martin Harris that he feels like Martin is owed. And this idea of Nephi trying to get the plates off Laban has other roots too. The idea of getting a treasure from a treasure guardian, going to them 3 times, bargaining with them, and being tricked by the treasure guardian and not obtaining the record. We see this mirrored in those accounts of those earliest understandings of this treasure guardian that guards the plates in the hill Cumorah, and that Joseph has to overcome in obtaining the record. But we also see it in this idea of a treasure dig, the idea that a seer like Lehi commands his 4 sons to go get this treasure and get it from the guardian and be able to bring it back home for their benefit. And so Laman confronts Laban and asks for the record because it's important to him, and Laban is angry and casts him out. And this might be based on a real event. Joseph is in Fayette working on the Book of Mormon. He wants to recover the lost manuscripts, so maybe him and a few others go to visit Martin Harris and plead for the record that he has lost, that Joseph believes that he is hiding. And maybe Martin Harris gets angry with them because Martin doesn't have the record, and so they leave empty-handed. We get an understanding from Nephi in chapter 3, the idea that these records are really important. They're going to preserve the history of these people and allow them to understand and have access to the holy prophets. And in many ways, this mirrors the idea of the Book of Mormon itself, that this is what it's going to do for its ancient inhabitants. And then the brothers try again by bargaining with Laban with their money and property, the idea that they can recover this record. And this may well have been another attempt by Joseph to try and get Martin Harris to relinquish the lost manuscript by offering him some money. And Martin just doesn't have the record, doesn't know what's happened to it. And so, again, he's angry. But from Joseph's point of view, he believes that Martin is this wicked man, because that's what we know from Doctrine and Covenants section 3 and then Doctrine and Covenants section 10, and believes that there's some conspiracy against Joseph. And so, yeah, the idea that Joseph can have all this anger against Martin Harris, which results in the story of killing Laban, I think that's a really good correlation. But there's also a biblical correlation, and this is from the Apocrypha, from the record of Judith in chapter 13. And you can see, if I've done this side by side with 1 Nephi chapter 4, and you can see that what happens with Judith, basically saving the people because the evil leader needs to be taken out. This is what happens in 1 Nephi chapter 4. The ideas parallel really closely, and some of the wording is the same. And you can see in the side-by-side, there's that same justification that the Lord has presented this opportunity for Judith to be able to save Israel by cutting off the head of this evil person. And that is what happens to Nephi in this account in 1 Nephi chapter 4. And so Nephi becomes a hero by being willing to do whatever it takes to secure the record and get it for himself. Dan Vogel postulates that this is actually somewhat the death of Joseph's ego, as he sacrifices himself and maybe his own honesty and integrity in order to get and bring forth a record. And another interesting thing that happens as part of this chapter is that Nephi enlists the help of the servant of Laban, who is Zoram, and Zoram comes with them into the wilderness and becomes Nephi's best friend, and also kind of the purveyor and keeper of this record. And this is a similar relationship that happens with Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery also leaves Western New York to come and help Joseph with the record, and he becomes an incredible close friend of Joseph, a confidant, a scribe, and he manages to ingratiate himself in the whole understanding of Nephi and being his bosom buddy. So we have in these chapters of Nephi a lot of similarities between the Bible and the Apocrypha with the account of Judith, but also these characters, these older brothers who are murmuring against their father, the idea of a treasure dig to get treasure from a guardian, an evil guardian who tricks them, the idea of a new friend, Zoram or Oliver Cowdery, who becomes really important to Nephi, who is the central character and the hero who is going to bring forth this record and save his people. And I think you can begin to see this idea of a Christian adventure story based on these biblical allusions, along with folk magic and treasure digging, and the idea of Joseph as Nephi being this hero of his family and saving them from, their particular lot in life. If you go to Palmyra, New York, where Joseph Smith grew up, one of the features of the town is these four corners which have churches on them. This is where the main roads intersect, and while not all of these churches were there when Joseph Smith was there, this just goes to show you how embedded the understanding of religious revival was in Western New York and how it impacted the immediate environment that the Smiths were in. The building in the top right corner is the Presbyterian Church, and Joseph Smith's mother, along with Hiram Smith, Sophronia, and Samuel, all joined this church in 1824. William Smith recounts much later that when Alvin died, the Presbyterian minister where they had the service embarrassed the family that they were not baptized. And so Lucy, who was struggling with her husband over religious matters, decided to break with her husband and join the church, and many of the other children went with her. Lucy came from more of a Calvinist background, and Joseph Smith Sr. was generally a Universalist, and so this was a particular matter of religious conflict in their home, and the event of Alvin dying really exacerbated this and meant that Lucy struck out on her own against her husband. This was quite typical in the 1820s with revivals where women were leading the charge for spirituality in their homes and often breaking from their husbands. But for Joseph Smith Jr., who supported his dad, this was a big area where it really was something that he needed to solve, and the Book of Mormon tends to do this in lots of ways, which we'll talk about. This first comes up in the Book of Mormon in 1 Nephi chapter 5, when the brothers get back from getting the plates from Jerusalem, and Nephi describes how his mother had complained against his father because he was a visionary man and had led them out from Jerusalem, that she was worried about the safety of her children. And Lehi admits that he's a visionary man, but that is the way that he's been able to obtain this land of promise. And through the process of Nephi getting the plates, Sariah, his mother, is converted to the will and understanding of his father. And these plates unite the family in their beliefs, but also their connection to God. And it validates the exodus from their homeland, just like Moses was led out of Egypt. Chapter 7 then sees Lehi send back the 4 brothers to get Ishmael and his family so that the boys would have wives and so that they would be able to have families going into the future. And I think this is a really big deal in the text because Nephi goes on 2 great quests at the behest of his father. One to get the plates from Laban and the other to go get wives. And this mirrors Joseph's own experience, where he went to Harmony, Pennsylvania with his father to get treasure, and then he went back to Harmony, Pennsylvania to get himself a wife, to marry Emma Hale. And funnily enough, the distance that Lehi has gone from Jerusalem is 3 days, and the distance from Palmyra through to Harmony, Pennsylvania is 3 days. Joseph knew this amount of time and this particular distance. And later on in Nephi, we see him get much more vague about what it means to be longer than this. We see many days and then we see several years. But this specific dating and timing of 3 days is really important for Joseph's understanding of the topography and those distances. But the idea that Sariah might have murmured against Lehi is very much the situation that Joseph was in his family in Palmyra, the idea that his mother, Lucy, murmured against his father. So that reconciliation between Lehi and Sariah is a really big deal to Joseph, as his own parents, Lucy and Joseph Sr., rallied and reconciled and got behind Joseph's getting the plates and being able to produce the Book of Mormon. The story of Lehi's family is relatable because it is the experience of the Smith family. Another well-known story in the Book of Mormon, because it's at the beginning of the text, is this dream of Lehi's about the tree of life. Lehi is accused of being a visionary man, and he is, and he admits to this. He talks about this vision of going to the tree of life and being able to partake of this beautiful fruit while being mocked by a great and spacious building nearby. Lucy Mack Smith describes in her 1845 history that her husband, Joseph Smith Sr., received many visions and dreams prior to their exodus from Vermont through to Western New York. One of those dreams, which she said happened in 1811, was about the tree of life. And this particular vision is very closely related to what turns up in the Book of Mormon in 1 Nephi chapter 8. Here is the side-by-side with Lucy Mack Smith's history on the left and 1 Nephi chapter 8 on the right. And you can see that there are many repeated phrases and lots of repeated ideas. This continues throughout the whole of the dream that Lucy Mack recounts. And even when the wording is slightly different, because Joseph Smith Sr. sees a rope and Lehi sees a rod, the rest of the wording is almost exactly the same. The same phrases in the same order with the same kind of outcome. And here's a side-by-side with just those examples right next to each other so you can see them. And here's a visual representation, and both of these were given to me by Rob, which is just beautiful. Now, one of the interesting things about this vision is it is recounted again by Nephi, who prays and gets his own understanding of the same vision. So I've done another side-by-side with Lucy Mack Smith's history on the left and 1 Nephi chapter 11 on the right. And it's interesting that this particular version of Nephi having this vision of the tree of life picks up slightly different things from Joseph Smith Sr.'s vision. But here again, you see these same wording choices and phraseology and lots of these complementary ideas. And even in Nephi's account, he is given a specific guide, the spirit, and then an angel, which I don't know why it changes during the course of the text, where in the original of Joseph Smith Sr.'s dream, he has a guide throughout, and this is not quite as present in that Lehi version in 1 Nephi chapter 8. And one of the interesting things about Nephi's account of this vision is that he's supposed to see exactly the same thing as Lehi has seen, but he describes a river of filthy water that is between the tree and the spacious building. And this becomes a bit of a problem, because then there is a third retelling of the story in 1 Nephi chapter 15, because the brothers who are listening to these visions don't understand some of the parts of it. And Nephi has to then go and explain it to them. And there's a specific reference to this water of filthiness, because in 1 Nephi chapter 15 verse 27, Nephi has got to explain why Nephi saw this in his vision, but Lehi left it out. Nephi says, so much was his mind swallowed up in the other things that he beheld not the filthiness of the water. Now, I think this is a really good clue that the text of the Book of Mormon is being used immediately. People in their household are reading it right after it's dictated. And because this part of the Book of Mormon is in Fayette, New York, the Whitmer household are reading the original account of Lehi's dream and then comparing it to Nephi's interpretation and finding some discrepancies. So that's why we have this third version of the vision, because 1 Nephi chapter 8 doesn't correlate perfectly with 1 Nephi chapter 11. And Joseph has to reconcile the two to the Whitmers, who are then reading this right off the press after it's being dictated. And I think this plays into a fundamentally bigger issue that is happening in the Whitmer home, and that is that there is some scrutiny, probably a little bit more scrutiny of Joseph and the production of these texts than was happening in Harmony. And Joseph realizes that he needs to finish this quickly and get out of the Whitmer home before too much investigation is done on what he's doing. And that's why we see a lot of these excuses for the text, particularly in these replacement pages where it's deemed to be just spiritual and it's small, and therefore Joseph can finish it quickly. And of course, then we end up having Omni cover 200 years in one chapter just to get to the end. And during Joseph's lifetime, nobody knew that there was a dream of Joseph Smith Sr. that mirrored this Lehi dream. And this was one of the reasons that Brigham Young hated Lucy Mack Smith's history, because it seemed to undermine some of these things that are present in the Book of Mormon. And this gave a lot more weight to the Smith family's involvement in the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and the church than what Brigham Young would have liked, which was that the church was really an endeavor which he was able to take over because he was then deemed to be the leader or prophet. Since it's the United States' 250th birthday, the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence from Britain, I thought it would be useful to check and show this in the text of the Book of Mormon. The church is an all-American church. It was made on American soil by an American patriot, Joseph Smith. His grandfathers both fought in the Revolutionary War. The Smiths had been in New England for hundreds of years. They really invested in the idea that America was special. It was the promised land. It was exceptional. And the things that were done in it were divinely inspired and also predicted. And this comes up a lot in the text where Nephi talks about his angel guide who directs him to see the foundation of the American Republic as divine. Some of that divinity comes from the endorsement of Jesus, who comes to the Americas. And Nephi describes in detail the destruction that happens for the Americas to be cleansed in order for Jesus to come. Now, this is in the replacement text, which is written after 3rd Nephi. And in fact, if you go to Mosiah, you can find that the prophets there don't know that Jesus is going to come to the Americas and certainly do not prophesy of these great destructions. And so it seems like this is something which has changed during the dictation process. And now Nephi is then able to really hone in on specificity around these events. Nephi also talks about how the Lamanites overcome and destroy the Nephites and become a dark and filthy and loathsome people that are the ancestors of the American Indians. And he talks a lot about the great and abominable church, which is the idea that the Catholic Church is this great cabal of the devil. This idea that the Catholic Church is the mother of harlots spoken about in Revelation in the New Testament is only present in the dictation which happens in Fayette, which seems to suggest that the anti-Catholic portions of the Book of Mormon are related to the audience and primarily the Whitmers, who are German reformers and very anti-Catholic because a lot of the Catholic wars that happened in Europe happened in Germany. Nephi also talks about seeing Christopher Columbus come to the New World and introduce the Gentiles to that portion of the world. And so Europeans obtain an inheritance in the Americas because they are fair and white and exceedingly beautiful, like the Nephites before they were destroyed. If you're getting white supremacy vibes here, you're not alone. And Nephi sees a divine deliverance of the Gentiles in the Americas from their mother Gentiles, Britain, who are fighting against them on the waters. And this establishes America as a promised land divinely decreed by God for this republic, this freedom, this democracy, which will allow the gospel to come forth. Because the Catholic Church has this huge hold on Europe and has corrupted the biblical record, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Nephi gets this charge that those who are blessed to bring forth this record in Zion in the last days will be incredibly blessed. And this must have been a really big deal for the Whitmers who are reading this straight off the dictation press in their homes and feeling incredibly connected to this work and a real understanding and belief that this is talking about them. And the whole idea about this work coming forward to fight against the Catholic Church and that evil church which has been founded by the devil must have been incredibly inspiring and purposeful for particularly the Whitmer family. They were going to be engaged in this great work which they had been specially chosen. And Nephi named John, which particularly the revelations of John in the last book of the New Testament, who they could be assured was given this great understanding to write down. So in these opening pages of the Book of Mormon with the replacement text, this embeddedness of America as great as fighting against the Catholic Church as a Protestant nation and also against Mother Gentiles, Britain as kind of a formation, kings, oppression. These really set America out as something special, as something divine and exceptional, and made the Book of Mormon incredibly passionate for the first readers who were American. Nephi has a fraught relationship, particularly with his older brothers. They believe him that he's sent from God. They don't believe him that he's trying to rule over them and become some kind of king. Nephi himself oscillates from being quite self-righteous through to having a lot of pain because of his brother's wickedness. And it seems like a fraught relationship all around. And this all occupies the text from 1 Nephi chapter 16 through to chapter 18, where we have this Exodus narrative from Jerusalem, and we also have a little inkling of a Noah narrative as they build a ship and cross the waters to the promised land. Nephi has to take his brothers to task many times, and they seem to take this very hard because, according to Nephi, they are wicked. But the brothers take wives, and this happens in 1 Nephi chapter 16, verse 7, and there's only one verse that suggests this. This is not eternal marriage, where marriage is the epitome of any relationship. This is convenience. And in 1 Nephi 16, we get introduced to this curious ball, which gives some directions, and it's kind of talked about as if it's like a compass. There's writing on this ball, and it works according to the faith and heed that you give it. This seems like another iteration of the seer stone. Joseph has got his seer stone, it's in his hat, it's giving him words on it that are then directing the work, including the translation of the Book of Mormon, but also the revelations that are coming forth in the Whitmer house. It's possible that these passages are a reminder to those who are engaged in the dictation and receiving these revelations that they need to act in exactness in following their commands. And it may be a way of Joseph putting the Whitmers in their place, in the sense that Joseph is in charge of this director, the seer stone, the compass, and that they need to acquiesce to his understandings and revelation. But there is a point at which Lehi murmurs against God because things are really hard, and Nephi is shown to be the more righteous of the two leaders, and there seems to be a leadership shift between Lehi and Nephi at this point. And this is probably autobiographical, the idea that Joseph Smith Sr. probably was kind of feeling like he was leading this work, and Joseph is stamping his mark on the idea that he is taking control and he is the seer. We kind of see this in Doctrine and Covenants section 4, when Joseph Smith Sr. comes to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and gets a blessing, a revelation from Joseph to him. And Nephi relates this idea that because of his preaching, the others are humbled and get on board with the project. In the same chapter, Ishmael dies in a place called Nahum. Ishmael dying and the daughter's mourning seems to relate to Emma Smith. In January of 1827, she elopes with Joseph, and they kind of flee through to Manchester, New York, to live with the Smiths. But we know from a few of her friends' statements that she was deeply unhappy. She had left a comfortable life with her family and her father, who really cared about her, and was then stuck in New York without them. And this loss hit her deeply. This is something that seems to reflect in the text at this point. There also seems to be some murmuring against Lehi and the idea that Joseph is putting himself above others. And this is a criticism that comes up a number of times. That he says that he has seen the Lord and talked with angels, but that he lies, that he's trying to become a king over this land. And so God has to chastise the brothers. And in their humility, they're able to work forward and go to the land of Bountiful to build a ship. One of the interesting passages in 1 Nephi chapter 17, verse 2, suggests that as they travel and have children, that they give plenty of suck. And it's interesting that Joseph, in his migration from Vermont to Western New York, travelled with his mother, Lucy, who was breastfeeding at the time. And so it's interesting that this makes its way into the text. Joseph is then commanded to construct a ship, much like Noah is commanded to perform and build the ark. And there's continued criticism that Nephi is like Lehi, the idea that he's been led away by his foolish imaginations and that they're wandering in the wilderness for no good reason. It's interesting that Joseph himself, when he talks about his history, he talks about this time leaving Vermont and going through to Western New York as a time in the wilderness. Nephi responds with this great treatise about Moses and the children of Israel and their exodus that brought them towards the promised land. A sermon that the Lord raises up righteous nations and takes them to precious lands. And that as he builds a ship, he sees many visions because the Lord is communicating with him as he's helping him to develop and to lead. But even on the journey on the waters, there is a rebellion, and the parents, Lehi and Sariah, are on their deathbeds because of how grief-stricken they are because of the rebellion of their children. But it all works out, and they get to the promised land, and they're able to plant the seeds which they brought with them, and they grew quickly so that they could have food. And then they found in the forest lots of beasts, in fact, cows and ox and ass and horse and wild goat. The idea that these things had been brought by the Jaredites during their migration and Noah's story. So if we're looking at this as autobiography, where do some of these ideas come from that are being placed into the text? We have a letter by Uncle Jesse Smith, who is writing to the family in June of 1829. And he talks about other letters that are going back and forth from the Smiths in Palmyra to Azel Smith, the grandfather, and to some of the other brothers. There are a few direct connections between this letter and probably others that relate to these passages that we've seen in Nephi. The letter is scathing, and Jesse relates the idea that the Smiths in Palmyra are talking to the extended Smith family about how God had brought them from the land of Vermont, much like Moses. Uncle Jesse's letter is written to Hiram Smith because, according to Hiram in the last letter, his father, Joseph Smith Sr., cannot write because of a nervous affliction. So it seems that we've got this kind of father being stricken on his bed, not being able to write, worried about things. And this seems to be included in the text that Nephi writes about Lehi. And one other comparison to this letter, there is an idea from Uncle Jesse that the reason why they're going after this gold and silver business and this golden calf, this book, is that they'll put them in possession of such great wealth that they will have dominion over all the lands of Palmyra. So the idea that Joseph Smith Jr. or even Joseph Smith Sr. is looking at this to be able to have it over other people, to be like a king in their little place. So while I think that the older wicked brothers are a composite of many of the people that are working against the Smith family, I think we can see that there are a lot of things that are going on which can be utilized as a Christian adventure story, and that the text of the Book of Mormon is responding to the kinds of criticisms that the Smith family are getting, particularly from their extended family. If the Book of Mormon is autobiographical and the people that mean the most to Joseph are in its pages, then one of the things that we would expect to see is the appearance of Alvin. Alvin died on the 19th of November 1823, and he was 25 years old. This was a huge economic and spiritual loss to the family because Alvin was really keeping the family together. He was the one that was sourcing the finances in order to pay the mortgage, and he was the one who was basically the head of the house. He was effectively Joseph's father. This is because Joseph Smith Sr. had become ineffective in providing for the family and was using speculative means to do so. Lucy Max tells the story in her 1845 history about how Alvin, on his deathbed, gave a blessing and a charge to all of the children. I put it side by side here with the blessings that Lehi gives to his children in 2 Nephi chapter 1 through to chapter 4. And you can see from the side by side that there is nothing that correlates in terms of phrases. Lucy's recounting of this event is not the basis by which Nephi is talking about his father Lehi. But it's interesting to see that Lucy Mack talks about how Alvin gathered each child and gave them a charge. And 2 Nephi chapters 1 to 4 also talk about Lehi gathering each child and giving them a charge. Alvin's death and deathbed charge really affected Joseph. The kinds of things that he told Joseph to do was to look after his parents. And Joseph took this very seriously, and maybe even took the charge that his older brother Hiram had got seriously when Hiram was not in a position to be able to effectuate it or to come through on it. And so Joseph, as the younger brother, needed to make amends for the older brother's inability to effectuate Alvin's charge. And we certainly see that with the character Nephi in 2 Nephi chapter 1, where Lehi tells the other brothers that Nephi has been looking after them, that he's been given this charge by God, and that they should listen to Nephi and work towards their righteousness by relying on Nephi's righteousness.